70 candles flickered across the length of the dining room, their glow bouncing off the silver balloons my son had insisted on buying. Everyone laughed when I pretended to blow them all out at once. Cheeks puffed, shoulders shaking. It was my 70th birthday, and for a few precious minutes I allowed myself to feel celebrated rather than inspected. I raised my glass to offer a thank you, and that was when I saw it just the slightest tilt of Alyssa's wrist as she stood by the bar. The stem of my marked flute sat apart from the others, a tiny etch shaped like a star that I had scratched years ago to keep track of my favorite glass. She glanced over her shoulder, slipped a dropper from her clutch, and released 2 clear beads into the champagne. They sank without trace. The room hummed with conversation, forks clinking against plates, and no one else seemed to notice. My daughter-in-law's face smoothed into a perfect smile as she lifted the flute, balancing it delicately, heading in my direction. My pulse thudded in my ears. Years of business dinners had taught me how to keep a straight face. Even when adversaries played dirty, I smiled back at her, let her place the flute into my hand as if it were a prize. "Nora, you deserve this," she said, her voice warm and rehearsed. "Thank you, dear," I answered. And I meant it in more ways than one. I held the glass a beat longer than necessary, letting the bubbles rise. Then I shifted, as though someone had called me from across the table. Carmen, Alyssa's mother, stood near the buffet with an empty hand. I placed my glass on the edge beside her purse, reached for a napkin, and in that moment of distraction slid the flute toward her. Carmen, absent-minded as always, picked it up without hesitation. The toast went forward. Guests lifted their drinks. I raised a fresh flute taken from the tray, the effervescence tickling my nose. To Nora, someone cheered. To 70 years of grit and grace, we drank. Around me, conversation resumed. Plates passed, laughter spilling over. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. I even began to wonder if my eyes had betrayed me, if paranoia had crept in with age. Then Carmen coughed. Once, twice, then harder. Her glass slipped, shattering on the hardwood. She clutched her throat, her face paling. Foam gathered at the corner of her lips as her knees buckled. Screams erupted. Chairs scraped back. People surged forward. Alyssa shrieked, dropping to the floor beside her mother, voice cracking as she begged someone to call 911. Her performance was almost flawless, but I had been in boardrooms long enough to recognize real panic from manufactured anguish. I forced myself through the crowd, kneeling near Carmen, pressing a handkerchief to her lips. Her eyes rolled back, her body convulsing in spasms. I murmured something soothing, though my mind was already racing. The guests swirled in confusion, some fumbling for phones, others crying, others frozen. "Mike, my son!" shoved through with a wild look, his hand gripping my arm. "Mom, stay back," he said sharply. "Let the medics handle it." But I didn't move. I watched Alyssa's hands trembling as she held her mother's shoulders, and I noted the glint of residue clinging to her manicured nails. My heart ached. Not for Carmen, though I pitied her, but for the truth settling into me like lead. The poisoned glass had been meant for me. The wail of sirens pierced the night, growing louder as red lights painted the windows. Guests pulled aside as paramedics rushed in. They worked quickly, strapping Carmen to a stretcher, loading her into the ambulance. Alyssa followed in tears, Mike close behind. I remained at the center of the dining room, broken glass crunching under my shoes, the echo of celebration replaced by whispers of dread. I pressed the damp handkerchief into my pocket, along with the truth I now carried, and braced myself for the questions that would come. And they came quickly, in the shadow of flashing lights, as the detective walked toward me. The living room emptied in waves as the paramedics carried Carmen into the ambulance. Neighbors huddled near the porch, whispering, while the last of the champagne sat untouched on the buffet. The scent of spilled wine and smoke from blown-out candles lingered in the air, sour and sweet at once. Alyssa clutched her clutch bag to her chest. Her sobs pitched just high enough for everyone to hear. She wailed about her mother's heart, about how Carmen had been so excited to celebrate tonight, about the unfairness of fate. Each word struck me as perfectly rehearsed. The tears were there, but her eyes flickered, scanning to see who was watching. Mike placed a hand on her shoulder, then turned to me. His face was pale, but his jaw set in a line I recognized from his childhood, the look he wore whenever he felt cornered. "This is what I was worried about, Mom," he said under his breath, low enough for only me to hear. "You live alone. You push people away, and then something like this happens. What if it had been you?" I met his eyes. Steady, though my stomach nodded. "But it wasn't me," I answered softly. He shook his head, exhaling through his nose. "You can't keep pretending you don't need help. It's dangerous. If you'd agreed to let us take care of you—" "None of this." He stopped himself, glancing at the guests within earshot. "None of this." The phrase clung to me like smoke. I slipped my hand into the pocket of my dress, feeling the damp fabric of the handkerchief I had pressed to Carmen's mouth. There, faint but unmistakable, was the residue from Alyssa's hands, the invisible proof I intended to keep. I folded it tighter, guarding it as if it were the last piece of common sense left in the room. The detective's questions were brief at first, focused on Carmen's health history and who had been near the drinks. Alyssa answered with a trembling voice, blaming stress, maybe low blood sugar. I stayed quiet, nodding when spoken to, offering the practiced smile of a woman too seasoned to betray what she knew. Guests began to trickle out, murmuring apologies, pressing my hand as they left. Their eyes told me they believed the story that Carmen had collapsed from age or nerves or some private medical trouble. Only I knew better. Only I had seen the dropper. The precise tilt of a wrist meant for me. When the last car pulled away, the house sank into a hollow silence. Alyssa had gone with the ambulance, Mike following in his own car, leaving me alone in a room that still smelled of celebration gone rancid. I closed the door behind the detective and leaned against it, the lights of the ambulance fading down the street. In my pocket, the handkerchief felt heavier than any jewel. It was not just a scrap of cloth, it was my shield. My reminder that survival sometimes comes down to noticing the smallest things and pretending not to. I turned out the lights, leaving only the candles guttering on the table, and told myself that tonight was only the beginning. Tomorrow, I would have to decide how to fight back. That night, after the last flashing lights had disappeared and the neighborhood returned to its usual quiet, I sat at my kitchen table with a pot of coffee and the handkerchief laid neatly before me. It was folded small, like a secret I couldn't yet bring myself to unfold. I stared at it and thought about how survival had become second nature to me, not just tonight, but through decades of being underestimated. When my husband, Charles, died 15 years ago, people expected me to fold too. We'd built our home together, our routines, our plans for retirement, and suddenly it was just me. I remember the casseroles neighbors brought, the sympathetic pats on the arm, the well-meaning suggestions that maybe I should sell the house and move closer to Mike. They assumed grief would shrink me. What they didn't realize was that loss had sharpened me instead. I started a home staging business with the little savings we had. It was meant to be temporary, a way to keep busy. But within 5 years, I had 3 employees and contracts with half the realtors in the county. It wasn't luck. It was the details, the smell of lemon oil that made buyers linger, the angle of a lamp that softened a room, the art of making a space feel alive. I learned that people see what they want to see, and if you give them the right cues, they'll believe it's their own idea. That skill saved me in business. Tonight, it had saved me again. I thought of Alyssa's hand slipping the dropper into my glass. If I had gasped, if I had pointed and accused her in front of everyone, she would have had a dozen excuses lined up: vitamins, bitters, a silly misunderstanding. She would have turned the crowd against me, cast me as paranoid, fragile, 70 years old and slipping. Instead, I smiled. I accepted the glass, and I let her believe she had succeeded. But patterns reveal themselves if you're patient enough to watch. The signs had been there for months. Mike arriving at my house with glossy brochures for retirement communities, saying, "Mom, it's not about control, it's about safety." Alyssa pressing me to sign simple papers that would make things easier in case something happened. Their insistence that my independence was reckless, that living alone was dangerous. They disguised it as love, but I know how to listen beneath words. What they wanted wasn't my safety, it was my signature. I had brushed them off at first, chalked it up to overprotectiveness, to the modern obsession with bubble wrapping the elderly. But the more they pushed, the clearer it became. They weren't worried about me falling in the shower. They were worried about what would happen to my bank accounts if I didn't. Now Carmen was lying in a hospital bed because I hadn't cried out, because I had chosen to let the pattern play itself through. Guilt prickled. But I knew one thing with certainty: if I had been the one rushed out on that stretcher, my story would already be written off as an accident. A woman of 70, too proud to accept help, collapsing in her own dining room. Neat, clean, unquestioned. Instead, here I was with a piece of cloth that smelled faintly bitter, a reminder that instincts honed over decades were still intact. I poured myself another cup of coffee, watching the steam curl upward. The house felt cavernous in its silence, but my mind was far from still. This wasn't just about one poisoned glass. It was about a plan, carefully arranged and waiting for me to stumble into it. They had underestimated me, the way men in suits once underestimated a widow trying to sell a dream of a staged house. And if there was one thing I had learned, it was this: when people think you're cornered, that's when you have the clearest view of their moves. Tomorrow, I would need to call someone who understood these games better than I did, someone whose pen could be sharper than any dropper. Detective Rowan Keats arrived the next morning, notepad in hand, expression balanced between concern and calculation. He had the kind of posture that told me he'd walked into plenty of living rooms like mine where celebration had soured into suspicion overnight. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, eyes scanning the untouched cake and half-emptied bottles on the counter. "I need to ask a few questions. Mrs. Whitfield," he began. His voice carried no judgment, only weight. I nodded. "Go ahead." He asked about Carmen's health, whether she had any history of heart trouble or medication conflicts. I gave what I knew: high blood pressure, but nothing more serious. He asked who had poured her drink. I said Alyssa had handed it to her, but didn't elaborate. "Not yet," Rowan wrote carefully, pausing between each note. Then he closed his notebook and leaned back. "The hospital ran a preliminary tox screen," he said. "They found traces of digitalis in her system. It's a compound used in certain heart medications, but in the wrong dose." He didn't finish the sentence. I folded my hands to keep them still. I know what digitalis can do. My father grew foxglove in his garden. I remember my mother warning us never to touch the flowers. His brow lifted at that. Not many people know that connection. I noticed details. I said simply. He tapped his pen against the notebook, then spoke more quietly. "My mother lost nearly everything when she got older. Not to poison, but to a caretaker who convinced her to sign over access to her accounts. By the time I figured it out, the money was gone. That's why I take these cases seriously. People target those they think are vulnerable." I met his gaze. Do I look vulnerable to you, detective? A faint smile flickered, but his eyes stayed sharp. No, but someone in your family might think otherwise. The words hung between us. Solid and undeniable. I rose and crossed to the sideboard where the bottles from last night still stood. My marked flute lay in the sink, rinsed clean, but the opened champagne bottle sat upright, 3/4 full. I placed it carefully on the table between us. This is the bottle Alyssa poured from, I said. I want it preserved and tested. Rowan studied me for a moment, then reached into his bag and pulled out an evidence bag. He slipped the bottle inside, sealing it with practiced care. You did the right thing keeping it. I almost threw it away. I admitted, but something told me it wasn't finished talking yet. He tucked the bag under his arm. I'll fast-track this to the lab. If it matches what was in Carmen's system, it strengthens our case. I leaned back in my chair, the exhaustion of the night finally catching up with me. And if it doesn't? Rowan's eyes hardened. Then we keep looking. Poisoners rarely stop after one attempt. The certainty in his tone sent a chill through me. I thought of Alyssa's steady hand, Mike's quiet insistence. The brochures they had pressed on me like medicine. This wasn't over. It was only opening. When Rowan left, I stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the empty space where the bottle had sat, and I knew my next call had to be to Elena Park. Elena Park met me in her office the following afternoon, her desk already stacked with folders marked in tidy handwriting. We had worked together for years. She had guided me through selling my business, drafting the first version of my will, even closing on my lake cabin. She was the kind of woman who never wasted words, which is why her first sentence set the tone. You're in danger, Nora. I didn't flinch. I had expected it. She adjusted her glasses, sliding a legal pad closer. I've reviewed what you told me about the champagne, the hospital report, and Detective Keats's findings, whether or not charges are filed. You need to prepare as if the threat will escalate. Her pen tapped against the paper. There are 3 main avenues people use when they want to control an elder's estate. 1, guardianship petitions. If they convince a court that you're incapable of handling your own affairs, you lose autonomy immediately. 2, overly broad powers of attorney. You sign once, and they have access to everything. 3, fabricated evidence of mental decline medical notes, witness statements, staged incidents. It doesn't take much to raise questions, and by the time you defend yourself, they've already locked down your assets. Her precision chilled me more than Alyssa's tears had. I folded my hands on the table. And you think that's what Mike and Alyssa are building toward? I'd bet on it, she said without hesitation. The pattern is classic. First, isolate you, push you toward a facility, away from allies. Then, insert themselves as your decision makers. The more they control access to you, the easier it is to shape the narrative. Mom's confused. Mom's paranoid. Mom can't handle the stress. I've seen it before, Nora. Once the court buys into that, your entire life is signed over. Her words tightened around me like a net. What do I need to do? I asked. Elena flipped open a folder. We'll start by updating your trust. The bulk of your estate will be shielded harder to challenge and impossible to raid without legal standing. We'll revise your will, reducing exposure to anyone who might contest it, and we'll draft new medical directives that state clearly who can and cannot make decisions if you're incapacitated. No ambiguity. She paused. Pen poised. I'll need you to designate alternate executors and trustees. People you trust absolutely outside the family, if necessary. I thought of friends I'd known since Charles's funeral, women who had stood by me when others drifted away. Their loyalty was earned, not inherited. I can name them, I said firmly. Good, Elena replied. We'll also schedule an evaluation with a certified geriatric psychiatrist, someone reputable, not the kind who sells diagnoses. A formal record of your competence will block any guardianship petition before it starts. I'll make sure it's notarized and filed. Her pen scratched across the page. Every stroke a defense against betrayal. For years, I had believed signatures were the language of security contracts, deeds, checks written to keep a family afloat. But now I saw how fragile they were. One signature could protect me. Yes. Another, slipped under pressure or deceit, could erase me. Elena looked up. We'll finalize drafts this week. Until then, do not sign anything they put in front of you, not even a grocery list. If they're bold enough to poison a drink, they're bold enough to slip papers in your hand and claim you agreed. I let out a long breath. Understood. She closed the folder with a decisive thud. Then, let's make sure your pen writes the last word, not theirs. When I left her office, I carried a satchel of drafts heavier than any suitcase, and I knew my next step had to be preparing the house itself, not just the paperwork. The knock came just as I finished pouring myself a cup of tea. Through the glass, I saw Mike's broad shoulders and Alyssa's polished smile. Both dressed as though they were heading to a real estate open house. My pulse slowed, steadying itself. I had been waiting for this visit. They entered with the air of missionaries certain of their message. Alyssa carried a glossy folder, the kind you couldn't throw away without feeling guilty about the printing cost. She set it on my kitchen table and spread out the contents like a dealer laying cards. "Mom," Mike began, voice warm but rehearsed. "We just want you safe. Cedar Bend is beautiful. Just look at the gardens, the art studio, the medical facilities. You'd have your own apartment. Full independence, but none of the risks of being alone," Alyssa chimed in. Her tone dipped in honey. "It's not a nursing home, Nora. Think of it as a resort for people who've earned the best years of their lives." I let my eyes linger on the photographs, silver-haired couples laughing on manicured lawns, watercolor classes under perfect skylights, a group doing yoga in matching pastel mats. It was carefully curated fiction, and they were betting I'd believe it. Mike slid another sheet across the table. This one was different, dense with paragraphs, full of lines for initials and signatures. His voice dropped an octave. "This is just the preliminary paperwork. A simple power of attorney, so we can handle logistics for you. Nothing binding until you decide." I picked it up, turning it over as if the legal jargon might float into meaning. Inside, I saw what Elena had warned me about sweeping authority over finances. Medical care. Property my entire existence condensed into fine print. I nodded slowly, as though persuaded. "It does look convenient. You know I've been thinking about the stress of managing the house." Mike exhaled, relieved, and Alyssa's eyes gleamed. They thought the battle was nearly won. Just then, the back door creaked. Grace, my granddaughter, slipped in quietly from the yard, her backpack still hanging off one shoulder, 16 years old. Sharp as her father once was at that age, she looked at the brochures, then at me, and her expression tightened in a way that said she understood more than anyone realized. "Grandma, I came to return your charger," she said quickly, holding out a small bag. But when she leaned close, she pressed something cold and slim into my palm. A USB drive. Her whisper barely reached my ear. "Don't let them see. It's from Mom's laptop." I closed my hand around it, hiding it beneath the folds of the brochure. My heart skipped. Grace's eyes met mine with a fierce urgency far older than her years. Then she straightened, offering a smile so sweetly casual that Alyssa didn't even glance up from her pitch. "We can take you for a tour this weekend," Alyssa said brightly, tapping one manicured nail on the photograph of a woman painting. "They'll hold an apartment if we move quickly." I forced a smile, resting my free hand over the stack of papers. "Let me look these over tonight. I'd like to be sure before we do anything official. Mike exchanged a quick glance with Alyssa, but he nodded. Of course. Mom, just don't wait too long. These spots go fast. When they left, I watched their car pull away, Alyssa's hand gesturing animatedly from the passenger seat. The brochures still lay on the table, glossy promises hiding a cage, but in my pocket was something more powerful than any brochure or contract, a flash drive that might tell me exactly what kind of game Alyssa had been playing and how long Mike had known. I set my teacup down, closed the blinds, and carried the USB to my study. I locked the study door before slipping the USB into my laptop. The screen blinked to life, the drive opening with a neat series of folders labeled in Alyssa's tidy hand: finances, insurance, plans. I forced my breathing to stay even, but already my chest felt tight. The first folder revealed spreadsheets, columns of numbers bleeding red, mortgage balances, overdue credit cards, car payments, luxury store accounts. Their debt was deeper than even Elena had guessed. It wasn't just mismanagement. It was desperation. The next folder froze me in place. Photographs. Poorly lit. Clearly snapped in haste. Insurance applications bearing my name. A policy for $500,000, dated just 6 months ago with Alyssa as beneficiary. I clicked through the images, bile rising higher with each page. My life had been itemized like merchandise, reduced to a payout figure and a line for relation to insured. The third folder sealed the truth I had already known, but dreaded confirming. A calendar entry titled in bold letters, Nora Birthday Toast. It was paired with screenshots of online searches, dosages of digitalis, interactions with alcohol, symptoms of poisoning. Every keystroke spelled intent. Every search was a confession. I sat back, my hands trembling. My birthday, my celebration, had been marked not as a milestone, but as an opportunity. A knock at the study door startled me. Grace's voice came softly through the wood. "Grandma, can I come in?" I wiped my eyes and unlocked it. She slipped inside, closing the door carefully behind her. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set with that stubborn tilt I recognized from childhood photos of Mike at the same age. "I saw you look at it," she said quietly. "The USB." I nodded. "Grace, how did you get it?" Her hands twisted the strap of her backpack. Mom leaves her laptop open all the time. I saw her searching weird stuff, and then I found the folder. I copied it because I didn't know what else to do. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. "Grandma, Mom told me if you didn't sign those papers, she'd make sure that you got scared enough to agree. She said it wouldn't kill you, just push you." The room tilted. I steadied myself against the desk. "She told you that?" Grace nodded, tears spilling now. "She said it was the only way, that Dad was drowning in bills and you were being stubborn." I wanted to believe her, but when I saw that calendar, I knew she was lying. I drew her into my arms, her small frame trembling against me. For a long moment, I just held her, hearing her muffled sobs against my shoulder. She was only 16, carrying a truth too heavy for anyone her age. When she pulled back, her eyes searched mine. "What are you going to do with it?" I closed the laptop, sliding the USB into my pocket. "For now, we keep it safe. It's proof, Grace. Proof of everything. But if you use it, she'll know it came from me." Her words cut sharper than any document I'd just read. Evidence was powerful, but Grace was still a child trapped between loyalty to her grandmother and the mother she couldn't stop loving. I brushed a strand of hair from her face. "We'll find a way that doesn't put you in the middle." "That's my promise," she nodded. Though fear still lingered in her eyes, I guided her out to the hallway, my hand steady on her back. When she left, the house felt heavier than before. My next step had to be careful. deliberate, and ruthless. The drive had given me answers, but also a question I wasn't ready to face: how to protect Grace while dismantling the people who raised her. I poured myself another cup of coffee and reached for the phone. It was time to call Detective Keats. I met Elena and Detective Keats in Elena's conference room the next morning. The blinds were drawn, and the table was cleared except for a recorder in the center and 3 cups of coffee. For once, it felt less like a lawyer's office and more like a war room. I slid the USB drive across the table. This is everything Alyssa had on her computer. Debts, insurance, a calendar marked for my birthday toast, and searches for digitalis doses. It's more than suspicion now. Rowan plugged it into his laptop, his face impassive as he clicked through the files. But when the insurance policy flashed on screen, his jaw tightened. "This is enough for a warrant," he said. "It ties her intent directly to you as the target." Elena leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "A warrant may stop them in their tracks, but if we want the case airtight, we need them caught in the act of using you. Signatures, transfers, a recorded admission. That will make it nearly impossible for them to claim misunderstanding." I folded my arms, feeling the handkerchief still tucked in my bag. "So how do we let them try without letting them succeed?" Elena smiled faintly, a predator's smile. "We bait the trap." She laid out the plan in crisp, deliberate steps. I would sign a power of attorney, one she drafted. Carefully tailored. On the surface, it would look broad enough to give Mike control over my finances. But in truth, it would grant access only to a single account we set up specifically for this purpose. An account with $1 in it. Every transfer they attempt, every login, every authorization will be logged and recorded, Elena explained. If they try to use it, we'll have evidence of their intent to misappropriate your funds. Rowan nodded. Already taking notes. I'll coordinate with cybercrime. We'll mirror the account activity in real time. As soon as they attempt a transfer, we'll trace it and move for arrest. With the insurance documents and the tox report, this becomes a conspiracy case. I exhaled slowly. And the recording, Rowan reached into his briefcase and set a small device on the table, audio and video, hidden in your study where they'll expect you to sign. If they pressure you, if they slip in papers you didn't agree to, we'll have it all on tape. Elena touched my hand. The key is to act convincingly. You have to let them believe you've given up, that you're yielding to their pressure. They won't show their full hand otherwise. I thought of Mike's relief when he believed I was considering Cedar Bend, of Alyssa's gleam of triumph. Pretending to bend would be easy enough. What worried me was looking my son in the eye while he tried to steal from me, and pretending it didn't shatter me. Still, I nodded. I can play the part. Rowan closed his notebook with a decisive snap. I'll draft the request for a warrant now. Once they make their move, we'll be ready. We ended the meeting with the weight of shared understanding. My role was clear. Let them believe I was theirs to control, theirs to guide into a cage disguised as safety. In truth, every step they took would bind them tighter to the net we had strung. When I left Elena's office, the city streets felt different. Less like the chaos of strangers and more like a stage where the next act was already scripted. My pen would sign their papers, but not for the reasons they thought. That night, I sat in my study under the quiet hum of the new recording device, waiting for the knock I knew would come. Cedar Bend rose from the manicured grounds like a promise. White-trimmed buildings gleamed in the sun, gardens stretched in perfect symmetry, and smiling staff opened doors as if we were royalty. Mike drove, pointing out features before we even parked, his voice light with forced excitement. Look at those walking paths. Mom, you'd love them safe. Well lit, benches everywhere. No risk of tripping in your yard. Alyssa, seated beside him, squeezed his hand in silent encouragement. then turned to me with her well-practiced sweetness. You'd never have to worry about groceries again. Nora, they even bring meals right to your door if you don't feel like going to the dining hall. I smiled faintly, leaning heavier on my cane than I needed to as we walked in. Let them think I was tired, worn, ready to be led. They mistook performance for surrender. Inside, a representative in a blazer guided us through the common space's sunlit reading nooks, a studio for painting, even a small theater. Everywhere, cheerful faces turned toward us, staff and residents alike. But I listened less to the tour and more to the undercurrent between Mike and Alyssa. At every turn, Mike's voice carried hope, almost relief, as though convincing me was the key to solving his entire life. Alyssa, on the other hand, corrected the rep with little flicks of authority. Does the medical team have 24-hour access, she pressed. How exactly are emergencies logged? And the financial requirements? What's the monthly overhead beyond the initial buy-in? Her questions weren't those of a concerned daughter-in-law. They were of a manager assessing property, weighing risk against profit. I let my hand linger on railings, nodded at the rose bushes, asked soft questions about activities. Do you have bridge tournaments? What's the waiting list like? The rep lit up with every inquiry, unaware that I was noting every word Alyssa murmured under her breath. She'll adjust quickly. Better for her mental health, safer for us all. Not safer for me, safer for them. When we reached the model apartment, Alyssa touched the small kitchen counter and said, "It's perfect. Just enough space. She doesn't need more." She didn't say my name. She said she, like I wasn't standing a foot away. Mike placed an arm around my shoulders, guiding me to a chair. Why don't you sit? Mom, imagine yourself here. No upkeep, no stress, just peace. His tone was coaxing, tender, but beneath it lay a current of urgency. I lowered myself into the chair, allowing my shoulders to sag. It is nice, I said softly, letting the words hang like surrender. Mike's eyes brightened. Alyssa's lips curved. They thought the fortress walls were crumbling, but inside, I was memorizing everything the contract language hinted at during the tour. The way Alyssa deferred to cost and control, the relief seeping from Mike's voice whenever he believed I might agree. Every detail was ammunition. By the time we left, Alyssa was already discussing next steps with the representative, promising to handle the paperwork once I confirmed. Mike squeezed my hand in the car, whispering, "You're making the right choice." "Mom," I smiled back, feigning gratitude, while my mind cataloged every sentence. They thought the velvet curtain had fallen over my eyes. They didn't see me pulling it aside, thread by thread. When we reached my driveway, Alyssa promised to bring the final forms that evening. Elena called just after lunch. Her voice clipped, but steady. The lab results came in. The champagne bottle you preserved tested positive for digitoxin, high concentration. It wasn't an accident. Nora, I pressed the phone closer to my ear, though the words already carved themselves into me. So the poison wasn't just in Carmen's system, it was in the bottle. Yes, Elena confirmed. Enough to kill. Keats will use this to expand the investigation, combined with the insurance documents. She hesitated. I also uncovered the policy myself, $500,000, taken out in your name with Alyssa listed as beneficiary. No mention of Mike. Just her. The tea in my cup had gone cold. She put a price tag on me. Elena's tone softened. That policy is motive in black and white. But I'll be honest, Nora, if this comes to trial, the defense will argue it was a mix-up, that the beneficiary listing was clerical. We need them reaching, signing, acting. That's what nails intent. I thanked her, set the phone down, and stared out the kitchen window. The garden Charles had planted years ago bloomed stubbornly despite neglect. Bursts of color against the neat hedges. $500,000. That was the value Alyssa had placed on erasing me. Later that evening, Grace slipped into my study, her eyes wide with worry. She perched on the edge of the chair, hugging her knees. "Grandma, you should know what I heard last night." I set aside my notepad. "Tell me." Her words tumbled fast, as if holding them in had burned. Mom and Dad were fighting in the kitchen. They thought I was asleep. Dad kept saying the bills were drowning them, that the credit cards are maxed, that even selling the car wouldn't help. And Mom Grace swallowed hard. Mom yelled that it was all pointless if you didn't sign. She said you're sitting on millions while they can't keep the lights on. I felt the sting of betrayal sharpen further. My son, once the boy who gave me crayon drawings on Mother's Day, now pacing his kitchen while his wife calculated my death into solvency. Grace's voice dropped. Dad said he didn't want to go along with everything, but Mom told him it was too late. That if you didn't move into Cedar Bend soon, the bank would take their house. She said you either agreed or you'd be forced. My heart ached at the thought of Mike caught in that storm. Yet weakness was not the same as innocence. Debt had stripped him of clarity, and Alyssa had filled the vacuum with poison and contracts. I reached for Grace's hand. "You were brave to tell me. But you mustn't repeat this to anyone else. Not yet. Do you understand?" She nodded, though fear flickered in her eyes. "What if they find out I told you I squeezed her hand? Then I'll protect you, the way I always have. That's my promise." After she left, I sat in silence. The ticking of the mantel clock louder than my own pulse. Digitoxin in the bottle. A 500,000 policy. Debts like anchors pulling them under, and in their desperation, they had convinced themselves I was the life raft. But they had forgotten one thing: I had survived storms longer and darker than this. When the knock came at my door that night, I already knew it would be Mike, papers in hand, searching for signatures that would never come. The knock came just as I was placing the kettle back on its stand. I opened the door to find Mike holding a leather folder, Alyssa hovering just behind him with that brittle brightness she wore like perfume. They stepped inside without waiting for me to invite them. "Mom," Mike said, his voice low and heavy. "We brought the paperwork. It's just a formality." "Really?" Alyssa laid the folder on my dining table and opened it with a flourish. "Power of attorney," she said, tapping the page as though she were presenting a prize. "This will make things so much easier. No more stress for you. We'll handle the details: bills, taxes, investments. You can finally rest." Her words carried the soft lilt of concern, but her eyes betrayed her. They darted from the page to my face, then to the pen resting beside it. Hungry, I lowered myself into the chair, letting my shoulders droop as though carrying the weight of 70 years had finally bent me. "It all looks very complicated," I murmured. Mike pulled out the chair beside me and set his hand on my arm. "It isn't. Mom, it just says you trust us. That's all." Behind the curtain of my performance, my mind stayed sharp. Elena had crafted these very pages, planted with careful traps. She was waiting in her office, connected to the recording device hidden in the sideboard, every word logged, every breath documented. I picked up the pen. Alyssa leaned forward, lips parted. "Just sign there, Nora. That line." I drew the ink slowly across the page. Steady enough to convince them, deliberate enough to ensure Elena's seals were activated. My name sprawled in practiced script. When I lifted the pen, Alyssa exhaled in relief, a smile curling across her face. "Perfect," she said. "Now we can move forward." Mike gathered the papers quickly, as though fearing I might change my mind. "Thank you. Mom, you won't regret this." They stayed just long enough for Alyssa to open her laptop on the table, her fingers clicking with urgency. She logged into the account Elena had set up, believing it to be my primary bank. Her eyes glowed with triumph. "See, already working," she said, sliding the screen toward Mike. He glanced at the balance, then frowned. $1, Alyssa tapped again, refreshing the page. That can't be right. She tried once more, her brow furrowing. No, there must be an error. Where are the other accounts? I feigned confusion. Tilting my head, is something wrong? Alyssa's tone sharpened. No, just technical issues. I'll sort it out later. Out. She snapped the laptop shut, the sound cracking like a gunshot in the quiet room. Mike stood, tension etched across his features. We'll fix it tomorrow. Mom, don't worry. But worry had already shifted to them. I could see it in the way Alyssa's fingers tapped her arm, in the stiffness of Mike's shoulders as he guided her out the door. Their plan, so meticulously crafted, had landed in empty air. When the door closed behind them, I exhaled for the first time in an hour. The papers they carried were worthless shells, bound to a hollow account designed only to watch them reach. My phone buzzed a moment later. Elena's voice came through, calm but firm. We've got it all: her login, her attempt, her reaction, Rowan's moving to file the warrant. I touched the recording device hidden in the sideboard, as if to thank it for bearing witness. They thought they had slipped a hand into my pocket. What they didn't know was that they had grabbed nothing but air and left their fingerprints all over the void. That night, as the house settled into silence, I knew the trap had closed. The next move would not be mine, but theirs. And soon enough, the laws... The flashing blue lights cut across my curtains just as I set down a fresh cup of tea. It was noon, but the house seemed to tilt into twilight as the squad cars rolled to a stop in my driveway. Neighbors peered from porches, pretending they weren't watching. I opened the door before the knock. Detective Rowan stepped inside first, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. His eyes were steady, but his jaw was set with a kind of finality. Behind him, Mike and Alyssa arrived in their car, clearly summoned. Alyssa clutching her handbag so tightly her knuckles blanched. Rowan wasted no time. He spread a folder on my dining table. The same table that had once held birthday cake and champagne. Now it held the record of betrayal. The toxicology report confirmed digitoxin in both the champagne bottle and Carmen Lopez's blood, he said evenly. The concentration wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. Alyssa's voice rose sharp and fast. That's ridiculous. I brought artisanal bitters to the party, herbal extracts. It must have been that. Digitoxin is natural. Right, Foxglove. Some kind of plant. You can't pin that on me. Rowan's gaze didn't flicker. You're correct that digitalis compounds can be plant-derived. What you left out is that the bottle was saturated at levels that could only come from deliberate preparation. And it matches your internet searches exactly. He slid a printed sheet across the table, screenshots of searches. Digitoxin dose alcohol. Digitalis poisoning symptoms. Alyssa paled. I don't know what this is. Anybody could have used my laptop, she stammered. Rowan's hand tapped the folder once more. Then explain the calendar entry. Nora birthday, toast. With a reminder set an hour before the party. That wasn't anyone else's handwriting. Mike's head snapped toward her. Alyssa, what is he talking about? His voice cracked on her name. She reached for his arm, desperate. But he pulled back slightly, confusion and dawning horror warring in his eyes. Rowan went further. And we have corroboration. A USB drive, pulled from your own files, handed over by a family member, including the insurance policy for $500,000 you filed 6 months ago, naming yourself as beneficiary on Nora Whitfield's life. The room went silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Alyssa's mask slipped. The frantic performance drained away, leaving a hardness around her mouth. You don't understand, she said at last. Her voice low. We were drowning. The debts, the house, the cars, it was all crashing down. Mike promised. Mike's face blanched. You did, she hissed. You said if your mother just signed, everything would be fine. That if she didn't, we had to make her. I didn't want Rowan raised a hand. Cutting her off. Mrs. Whitfield. You are under arrest for attempted murder, insurance fraud, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent. The officers moved in, pulling her hands behind her back. The clink of cuffs loud in the still house. Alyssa twisted to look at me, her eyes filled with venom. You think you've won, old woman. You don't know what you've started. I held her gaze. Steady, unbroken. I know exactly what I've ended. They led her out the door, her protests spilling into the noon air. Mike remained, shoulders slumped, eyes fixed on the floor. He looked less like my son and more like a man stripped of every excuse. Mom, he whispered. I didn't know she'd go that far. I said nothing. Silence was heavier than any answer. Rowan lingered, giving me a final nod. This is just the first step. Nora, one arrest doesn't close the book, but it does turn the page. When the cars pulled away, the blue lights fading down the street, I was left with the echo of cuffs, the fracture of family, and the certainty that this wall of lies had only begun to crumble. The house felt cavernous after they led Alyssa away, yet Mike didn't leave. He stood in the entryway, shoulders bowed, as though the floor itself might swallow him if he moved. His silence pressed heavier than the echo of the police cars fading down the street. Finally, he looked at me. I swear, Mom, I didn't know about the poison. I never agreed to that. She said we could scare you. Make you realize how unsafe it was living alone. A break-in staged. Or maybe a fainting spell. It was supposed to be harmless. I walked to the study and returned with the printouts Rowan had left on the table. I slid them across the wood toward him, the calendar entries, the insurance photos, the search history. Then, from my pocket, I pulled out the sheet of messages I'd copied from his phone the night Grace handed me the drive. Read them, I said, my voice level. He did. His lips moved silently over the words, each line chiseling the denial from his face. She'll be easier to convince after the party. If she won't sign, we'll make her see reason. Don't worry, it will look natural. His hands trembled as the pages slipped from his fingers. I didn't think. His voice cracked. God, I didn't think it would go this far. He buried his face in his hands. I was drowning. Mom. The debts, the business falling apart. I couldn't see a way out. She told me this was the only way to save us. I thought if you just signed, everything would settle down. I never thought she'd slip poison into my glass. I finished for him. He winced, eyes shining with a grief that looked almost boyish. For a moment, I saw not the man before me, but the child who used to bring me dandelion bouquets, who once swore he'd never let me cry alone. Please, he whispered, reaching across the table. I'm begging you, tell them I didn't know. Tell them I never wanted you hurt. I didn't take his hand. Instead, I folded my arms, steady as stone. You want forgiveness. Then you'll do one thing for me. When this reaches court, you will tell the truth. No more half stories. No more excuses. You will testify, under oath, about every conversation, every plan, every pressure she put on you, and every way you agreed. That's the only way I can stand to call you my son again. His face crumpled, torn between shame and relief. If I do that, they'll destroy me. They already have, I said softly. The only choice left is whether you go down with her lies or stand up in your own truth. For a long time, he didn't speak. Then he nodded once. Slow but certain, as if the weight of it finally pressed into his bones. I'll do it. I'll tell them everything. I studied his face. Searching for the boy I remembered, he was still there, hidden under years of fear and debt and compromise. But the man he had become had to answer for his choices. I rose from the table, gathering the papers into a neat pile. Then we'll see what the court makes of you, Mike. Until then, keep your distance. I need space to remember the son I raised without choking on the man who almost let me die. His eyes filled, but he said nothing more. He left the house quietly, the door closing behind him like a final period at the end of a sentence. I turned back toward the study, where Rowan's evidence still glowed on the laptop screen, and prepared myself for the storm of a courtroom. The courtroom smelled faintly of varnish and old paper, the kind of scent that clings to places where lives are measured in testimonies and verdicts. I sat behind Elena at the petitioner's table, my hands folded, my back straight. My name had been called dozens of times during my career in business, but never like this. Never as the intended victim of my own blood. Elena rose with calm precision, the click of her heels punctuating the silence. "Your Honor," she began, "we present clear evidence of premeditated intent." She handed the clerk a thick binder. Inside were copies of the champagne bottle analysis digitoxin confirmed at lethal concentration. Alongside it, photographs of Alyssa's internet searches, the insurance policy bearing her name, and the forged narrative of my supposed incapacity. The judge leafed through each page, expression unreadable. Rowan, seated nearby, watched the room with the quiet vigilance of a man who had seen too many families broken on the stand. His gaze flicked once to me, a nod of assurance that I held onto like an anchor. The prosecution called Grace next. My granddaughter walked to the witness stand with her chin trembling but high. At 16, she had no business in a courtroom like this, yet she carried herself with more dignity than half the adults present. She swore in, then began. I saw my mom looking up things on her laptop. Medical stuff, dosages, and she told me if Grandma didn't sign the papers, she'd have to scare her into it. Grace's voice cracked, but she pushed forward. "That's why I copied the files onto a drive. I didn't want Grandma to get hurt." The room shifted, whispers rustling like dry leaves. Alyssa glared at her daughter from the defense table, but Grace didn't flinch. She looked straight at the judge, straight at the truth. Elena guided her gently. "Did anyone else know about these files?" "Yes. I gave them to Grandma. She showed them to Detective Keats." "Did your father ever mention harming your grandmother?" Grace hesitated. "Not harming. He just said Grandma would be easier to convince after the party, that it would look natural." The judge leaned back, exhaling heavily. When the prosecution rested, Alyssa's attorney rose, scrambling to paint a different picture. "Herbal bitters," he repeated. "Unfortunate coincidences. An overwhelmed mother under financial stress." But his voice lacked conviction. The pile of evidence towered too high. The judge called a recess, then reconvened for sentencing. Alyssa was remanded into custody without bail, charged with attempted murder, insurance fraud, and conspiracy. Her jaw tightened as the cuffs snapped around her wrists. She didn't look at me as the bailiffs led her away. Mike, meanwhile, had taken a plea deal. Conspiracy to defraud, reduced in exchange for full cooperation and testimony. He stood pale and hollow, his lawyer whispering instructions he barely seemed to hear. He avoided my eyes, though once his lips formed the words, "I'm sorry," without sound. The gavel struck once, sharp as thunder. Elena gathered her files with deliberate care, her voice low as she leaned toward me. "It's only the beginning, Nora. But justice has started." "But justice?" Rowan caught my gaze from across the aisle, his nod quiet but resolute. In that gesture lay confirmation the trap had held. The evidence had spoken. And for the first time since that poisoned glass, I felt the law had taken my side. I rose, smoothing the skirt of my suit, and walked out into the sunlight of the courthouse steps, carrying both the weight of loss and the faint glimmer of something like safety. The next chapter of my life was waiting just beyond those doors. The house felt different after the trial, as though its walls had exhaled at last. The shadows that once clung to every corner began to lift, replaced by a steadier kind of quiet. I walked through each room, touching the furniture Charles and I had chosen decades ago, and realized I no longer needed these rooms to anchor me. My life didn't have to be preserved in oak and porcelain. It could be replanted. Elena and I met in her office the following week. She slid a stack of papers toward me, her pen resting neatly on top. "We've restructured your trust," she explained. "The assets are secure, airtight. And per your request, a scholarship fund has been created in your name, with Grace designated as the first recipient." I let the words sink in. A scholarship wasn't just money, it was a seed. Grace would carry it into whatever future she chose. A reminder that her courage had rewritten more than my safety. "She deserves it," I said. She carried the truth when no one else would. Elena smiled faintly. "You've given her more than an education. Nora, you've given her proof that standing up matters." I signed each page with steady strokes, each signature a line drawn between what had been taken and what I had reclaimed. Selling the house was the next step. Realtors walked through, praising the space, calculating its value. But for me, the decision wasn't about profit. It was about freedom. I chose a smaller place across town, a cottage with a garden just large enough to remind me of Charles without overwhelming me. When I packed the last box, I felt no grief, only the relief of leaving behind walls that had once heard Alyssa's footsteps. Rowan visited me one afternoon at the cottage. His tie loosened, a folder in his hand. "We're organizing community workshops," he told me. "Sessions on recognizing financial abuse, setting up protections before it's too late. Would you consider speaking? Your story could save others." I looked out at the garden, where seedlings were just beginning to push through the soil. "Yes," I said. "If my voice keeps one woman from signing away her freedom, it's worth it." Together, we drafted an outline. Rowan would cover the legal red flags, sudden changes in wills, unexplained transfers, family members pressing for signatures. I would speak of instinct the way a glance, a phrase. A shift in tone can reveal more than documents ever do. Elena agreed to provide practical tools, sample trusts, healthcare directives, lists of vetted evaluators. When I stood before that first group in the library hall, my hands didn't tremble. I spoke of my birthday toast, of the glass I switched in silence, of the way poison can wear a smile you've known for years. Faces in the crowd tightened, some in anger, some in recognition. And afterward, when an elderly man took my hand and said, "You just described my daughter's pressure word for word," I knew the work mattered. Back home, I tended the garden. Each rose bush I planted was a boundary, each trimmed hedge a reminder that life could be shaped on my own terms. Grace came often, kneeling beside me in the dirt, her laughter carrying more freely now. She still bore the weight of divided loyalties. But with each afternoon in the sun, I saw the burden ease, the garden grew, and so did I. I had rebuilt my trust, redirected my legacy, and turned the debris of betrayal into soil for something living. And still, as the days lengthened, I knew there remained one conversation unfinished, the words Mike owed me. And the truth he had yet to lay bare. My 71st birthday arrived without fanfare, and that was exactly how I wanted it. No chandeliers, no staged toasts, no eyes watching for weakness. Just a modest dinner in my new cottage. The table set with a simple runner and the good china I'd kept. Neighbors filled the chairs, bringing casseroles and laughter, their voices weaving through the room like warm thread. Grace sat beside me, her hair pulled back, a spark of teenage confidence returning to her smile. She had insisted on helping me cook. And though the bread was a little overdone, it tasted better than any feast I'd ever had. Rowan arrived just after dessert, a folder tucked under his arm. He laid it gently beside my plate, not interrupting the conversation until the others had shifted into smaller clusters. "Case closed," he said quietly, sliding it toward me. Inside were final statements, Alyssa's conviction, the formal sentencing, Mike's plea deal accepted. The signatures of judges and clerks marked the end of months of hearings, questions, and rehearsed lies. A wall of text, heavy with bureaucracy, but underneath it all, the truth stood written. I closed the folder and rested my hand on it for a moment. "So this is what justice looks like," I said softly. Rowan's expression softened. "It's never as clean as it should be, but it means you can breathe easier now." I nodded. Though I knew the past doesn't vanish with a gavel strike, it lingers like a scar healed, but permanent. Grace tapped my shoulder. "Grandma, I have something for you." She handed me a small box wrapped in plain paper, tape clumsily folded. I unwrapped it to find a glass tumbler, its surface etched with a single tiny star. Not polished, not symmetrical, but hand-cut. The grooves rough beneath my fingers. Her eyes shone. I thought, since last year's glass was so awful, you should have one that's only yours. No one else touches it. The room went still around me. I traced the star, feeling the ridges bite gently into my skin, anchoring me. A glass that was mine, marked not by someone else's plan, but by choice, by love. I lifted it, filled with water instead of champagne, and held it up to the light. The star caught and fractured it, scattering reflections across the table. "Perfect," I whispered. "Thank you, Grace." She leaned her head against my shoulder, and I kissed the crown of her hair. For all the bitterness of the past year, here was sweetness untarnished. The neighbors clapped gently, raising their own glasses in an improvised toast. Rowan lifted his coffee mug, his steady eyes meeting mine. "To 71, he said, "to resilience." The words settled into me, solid and true. As the night wound down and the last dish was stacked in the sink, I lingered at the table alone. The folder with the case files sat beside the new glass, symbols of two different kinds of endings, one dictated by the law, the other written in love and survival. I ran my hand over the etched star once more, then set the glass carefully in the cabinet, front and center. It would be the one I chose, the one I lifted, on every birthday to come. And as I turned off the lights, the quiet house no longer felt like an echo. It felt like mine again, waiting for whatever tomorrow might bring. I have learned that there are poisons you can taste and poisons you can't. The first nearly ended me in a champagne glass. The second lingered longer disappointment, betrayal, the ache of watching your own blood choose debt and deceit over truth. That poison, too, I swallowed, but I never let it finish me. Now, in the quiet of my cottage, I put pen to paper. The letter is for Grace, folded neatly on the desk where the sunlight falls in the afternoons. "My dear girl," I write, "what I leave you is not a right, but a responsibility. Inheritance is not measured in accounts or deeds. It is in courage, in vigilance, in knowing the difference between help and control. You have already proven you understand that. Carry it with you. Protect others as you protected me. This is the legacy worth more than money." I pause, letting the ink dry, then continue. "Do not look for fairness in bloodlines. Look for it in actions. Choose your table carefully, not by who demands a seat, but by who earns it. You will know the difference." I seal the envelope, place it atop the stack of documents Elena helped me prepare, and feel a calm certainty settle in my chest. Outside, dusk gathers. Porch lights flicker on up and down the street, one after another, until the neighborhood glows with a quiet constancy. I watch them from my window. Hands folded around the glass, Grace gave me the star etched into its side, catching the faint light. I think of what nearly happened, of the drink that was meant to silence me, and I think of this glass. Chosen, lifted, mine alone. Survival was not the victory. The victory is this passing forward a life no one else can poison. And with that, I turn off the lamp, let the house settle into its night rhythm, and step into tomorrow, carrying only what I choose. Title thumb. Title. At my birthday party, my daughter-in-law put something in my drink, so I switched glasses. Thumbnail at my birthday party. I saw my daughter-in-law put something in my drink. When no one was watching, I switched the glass in silence. Minutes later, she started shaking, and everyone froze. Description. I survived not by luck, but by refusing to let betrayal define me. This is my story of strength, family, and the choice to protect what truly matters. Watch until the end and tell me your thoughts. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to support. Historias con Elena. Historias de vida. Historias de venganza. Historias que inspiran. Historia conmovedora. Historias reales. Título. En mi fiesta de cumpleaños, mi nuera puso algo en mi bebida. Así que cambié las copas. Thumbnail texto para la imagen en mi cumpleaños. Vi a mi nuera poner algo en mi copa. Sin que nadie lo notara, la cambié en silencio. Minutos después, ella empezó a temblar y todos se quedaron helados. Descripción. No sobreviví por suerte, sino porque me negué a dejar que la traición me definiera. Esta es mi historia de fortaleza, familia y la decisión de proteger lo que realmente importa. Quédate hasta el final y comparte tus pensamientos. No olvides darle like, suscribirte y compartir para apoyar a Historias con Elena, historias de vida, venganza con clase, relatos que inspiran, historias con corazón, cuentos reales.